On August 12th, the city of Charlottesville found itself at the center of attention of the nation and the world. This small city, best known as the home of the University of Virginia, has become a lightning rod for individuals calling themselves the alt-right or white nationalists, as well as the KKK American Nazis and the other white supremacists. Late last year, the Charlottesville City Council voted to remove a statue honoring Civil War Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Since then, there have been a number of protests by these groups. In response to the increased presence of the hate groups in Charlottesville, hundreds of people came out and protested against these groups on August 12th. What happened that day had brought increased attention to the city and the issue of race relations, the right to free speech, and has now spilled over into politics after President Trump declared blame on both sides of the protest. I'm here in Charlottesville, Virginia, to talk with some of the people who live here and see what they have to say.
James Donovan, Charlottesville, Virginia.
Hi, I'm Rhonda, and I live in Charlottesville, Virginia.
I'm Raquel White, and I live here in Charlottesville, Virginia.
How have the recent events in Charlottesville affected the city?
Oh, it's been terrible, like a death. You know, people are upset. Everybody I know, they don't understand why it happened, and it's frightening. And I'll tell you, it makes you rethink some things, and then also it makes you nervous. So, I'll be at the library and I'll hear a police or an ambulance go by, and I'm startled in a way that I didn't used to be. So it's very upsetting, and there's information coming out about what the state or city knew and maybe should have done differently. And so it's also something that's ongoing. It hangs over the political air, and people talk about it a lot. And it makes for a lot of anxiety, I think. It's a terrible tragedy.
How have the events that recently occurred in Charlottesville affected the city?
Very negatively, actually. It's really been a shame. Put a bad light on our city, which is really a beautiful city and a beautiful place to live. Lots of diversity here, welcoming, loving community. It's a sad thing.
It has affected the city in a big way. There's people. My husband works at the Omni, and there's been wedding parties that have canceled. Friday was our big paint the town orange is this thing that we do just to bring in the fall with the football players and UVA, and they canceled yesterday because they said they didn't feel safe coming down here. So it has affected us in many ways.
President Trump has stated that both sides, protesters and counter-protesters, are to blame for the violence that occurred on August 12th. He also stated that there were fine people on both sides. How do you feel about his statement?
I think it was inartful. I do think the federal government had an understanding that people who weren't from this area were trying to meet here to fight. They monitor their social media and everything. So I think having that information may have made him think that there were two sides to the fight. But, the victims were really just the peaceful protesters and the city itself. That's how I feel about it. I remember when the Nazis, I read about this in law school, the Nazis marched in Illinois through a particular neighborhood, and the response there was everybody showed up, but they all quietly turned their backs. And I think, juggling sort of the freedom of expression and public safety, I sort of come down a little bit more on the public safety side. I don't think the people who were showing up with that riot gear were intending to have an expression of ideas. They were intending to fight. And I'm disappointed the city government and the state government didn't do more to stop that, particularly because in July, there'd been the KKK rally, about 40 or 50 people, and a few thousand people showed up to protest that. And amongst those few thousand were people who were pretty wanting to have a fight. And so the state police actually had to use tear gas to protect the KKK. So I think that they had an understanding that this was a dangerous situation. They barely could maintain control when there were only 40 KKK people. So knowing there were going to be a few hundred, and knowing they'd had criticism for using the tear gas, I think that's part of why they kind of stood aside. The police stood aside to the degree they did. I mean, they declared an unlawful assembly. There were a couple hours of fighting, street fights, and like many fights, and only 6 people were arrested on the day, including someone who ran over, killed a woman and ran over 19 people. So that means to me that the police didn't make as many arrests as they certainly could have. And I don't know why that seemed like a bad choice to me. But, as to President Trump, he says all kinds of things in so many directions that, I find a lot of his reactions are unhelpful. I don't know what he was thinking about in terms of trying to equate people. I think we have too much political violence in this country, but I don't think that, I don't think he handled it very well.
President Trump has stated that both sides, protesters and counter-protesters, are to blame for the violence on August 12th. He also stated that there were fine people on both sides. How do you feel about his statement?
I do agree with that. I think that if people have the right to have a voice, and if there are no protesters, then they're just people talking to each other. So, and also the protesters have a right to their voice. So when those two clash, sometimes there's a problem, which happened here, unfortunately. So I'm hoping that nothing like that happens again in this city, anywhere really.
I disagree with his statement. I don't think there's fine people on both sides. If you come with intention to hurt, if you come with intention just to protest, I think it's fine. But most of the people that came, they came with intention to hurt because they had all their headgear and shields and all their battle gears on. And as I stated before, I don't think that he's setting an example, because instead of toning down the rhetoric, he's making it worse by just keep going on and tweeting about this stuff. If we want to get rid of it, we need to tone down the rhetoric altogether.
What has the statue of Robert E. Lee in Emancipation Park represent today? And what do you think should be done with it?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know what it represents today. I like history a lot, so I'm always anxious about how quickly people move in one direction or another. But thinking more about it, history is a continuum, and it doesn't stand still. So the groups of people who saved money and made an effort to build that park and then to dedicate that statue, that was a certain time in history, okay? And we're likely living in a different time. And whatever their motives may or may not have been, if our time is sufficiently different, if the statues are causing people to feel like second-class citizens in our own country, then that's something that a democracy should be able to respond to. But it should have a peaceful way of doing it. So the state of Virginia has a law saying you can't remove these statues. And there's a legal argument as to whether they retroactively apply to statues from before 1997. But, I'd like to see issues like this in the political realm that affect people so deeply be handled peacefully and through the courts and through voting, so people could run and say, hey, I'm running for the General Assembly and I'm going to sponsor a bill that's going to overturn that law, that's the approach I'd rather take with it. And I don't know, a lot of our history, they're really imperfect people, and it doesn't make them any less important historically. But then maybe a statue isn't the way you learn about a person, because a statue, you put them up high, it's almost like you're revering them as opposed to remembering their place in history, right? And, but also as a nation, as such a heterogeneous nation, we're going to need historical understanding of the evolution of the country to hold the people together. If we're a nation that's made of ideas and not a certain race or religion or ethnicity, the way most nations are, then the shared ideas are a very important part of how we think of ourselves as a people. But I would say that, I'm optimistic, and, you see what's happening in Texas and people helping each other. And that's the Charlottesville I know, and that's the America that I know. And I think that's the great middle of the country. So the extremes might want things to be violent, but the great middle of the country lives differently than that. And I hope is immune to a lot of that rhetoric as well.
It represents, for me, history. I mean, it is our history, which can't be changed. I hope we've learned from that history and can change how we feel about civil rights, human rights. I think it's fine to leave it where it is. I have no problem with wherever it is. So that's kind of my feeling about it.
What does the statue of Robert E. Lee in Emancipation Park represent today? And what do you think should happen to the statue?
I think the statue should be removed. I don't think it represents anything today. I think that most of these monuments across America should be removed and put into a museum so people can see it, just like how you have the Black History Museum that everybody goes to in D.C. We need to put it in the Confederate Museum. They can go and see it in the museum.
I want to thank the people of Charlottesville who took the time to talk with me today. When I saw what was happening just 3 weeks ago, I was shocked that it could be happening in 2017. I felt like this must be some other country. Nazis and KKK with torches yelling racial slurs in a town 2 hours from my house. There may be some fine people who are unhappy with the way America's going, but I do not understand any fine person siding with hate. From Charlottesville, Virginia, for 3 Questions with Ava Rosa, thanks for watching. See you next time.